Abandoned by her millionaire fiancé, a pregnant young woman finds unexpected refuge in the hands of a stranger. But she catches the elderly man crying while talking to someone on the phone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain incessantly drumming on the shiny hood of the car parked at the entrance of the mansion. Emily Foster, with her soaked hair clinging to her forehead and tears mingling with the raindrops, remained motionless. She stared at the closed door in front of her, waiting for it to open again, waiting for him to appear. To say it was all a misunderstanding, but deep down she knew it wouldn't be like that. Sebastian Turner's voice still echoed in her head, like a dagger twisting in an open wound. "You think you can ruin me with this, Emily? That I would ever accept this mistake as part of my life?" He had said it with cold disdain, his icy blue eyes fixed on her, as if he were looking at a broken object. And then the door had closed, forever. Emily looked at herself, her hands trembling as she hugged her belly, which was beginning to show beneath her simple cotton dress. She hadn't asked for this to happen. The pregnancy had come unexpectedly, but she had accepted it. She had loved it. "He's not a mistake," she murmured to herself, as if speaking directly to the child she carried. Reluctantly, she took a step back, feeling her bare feet sink into the cold mud that had accumulated at the cobblestone entrance. Her sandals had been left behind when he had pushed her out of the house, like an inconvenience that needed to be discarded. A thunderclap rumbled in the distance, shaking the ground beneath her feet. Emily tightened her arms around her body, shivering from the cold that cut through her wet skin. The sky seemed in tune with what she felt, tumultuous, dark, and relentless. "And now," she whispered to herself, taking one last look at the imposing mansion, its windows illuminated and indifferent. To her, that place felt like another world, unattainable. It had been a promise of a perfect future, now shattered in a single night. Forcing her legs to move, Emily walked away from the property. Each step felt heavier than the last. The rain intensified, whipping her face and further tangling her wet hair. She followed the empty road, her bare feet scraping against the cold asphalt. The small town of Willow Creek seemed abandoned at that moment. No souls, no light to guide her. As she walked, flashes of the past returned, hurting her more than the cold rain. The smiles exchanged with Sebastian, the wedding plans, the promises of a forever. But now, his cruel voice was all that remained, repeating itself relentlessly. "I don't want this child, and I don't want you anymore, you." Minutes turned into hours. Emily's mind began to cloud as the weight of abandonment and fatigue consumed her strength. She knew she needed to find shelter, but her feet carried her mechanically, as if they no longer belonged to her. When she spotted the indistinct shapes of a small church in the distance, she could hardly muster the energy to feel relieved. The bell in the tower seemed like a silent sentinel, watching over the sleeping town. The stone steps were soaked, and Emily climbed them with difficulty. The door was locked. Left with no options, she sank down against the wall, burying her face in her knees. For a moment, exhaustion overcame even the cold. And that's how Henry Collins found her. Henry's figure emerged like a spectre in the rain, protected by an old waterproof coat that barely covered his hands. He carried a lantern, the flickering light illuminating the outline of the young woman slumped against the church. For a moment, Henry froze, surprised. His brown eyes carried an ancient weight, but an immediate concern sparked within them. "Miss," he murmured, approaching cautiously, "are you all right?" Emily didn't respond. Her lips were blue and her breathing was shallow. Henry placed the lantern beside her and knelt, gently touching her shoulder. Her skin was cold. "Oh my God," Henry whispered. There was no hesitation in his movements as he removed the coat and draped it over Emily's shoulders. With surprising strength for someone his age, he lifted her into his arms. "It's going to be all right, miss. I'll take care of you," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Henry carried Emily through the empty streets to his home, which was just 2 blocks away. It was a modest wooden house with small windows and warm yellow lights. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, the sound of the rain diminishing as if they had left another world behind. Henry laid Emily down on the old sofa in the living room. He turned on the lamp beside it, illuminating the cozy space. The room smelled of tea and old books, and the walls were covered with black and white photographs. Some framed, others just taped up. A silent, forgotten past, much like the owner of the house himself. "I'll grab a towel," Henry said, hurrying down the hallway. His voice was firm, but his hands trembled. Emily's presence, so young and vulnerable, shook him more than he would care to admit. He returned with a towel and an old blanket, covering her with care. Emily began to murmur something softly, her eyes moving beneath her closed eyelids. "Shh, it's all right," Henry said gently. "You're safe here." Gradually, the warmth and softness of the blanket seemed to bring life back to Emily. She opened her eyes slowly, and the sight of an elderly man leaning over her made her flinch. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse and trembling. "You're in my house," Henry replied, moving back a little so she wouldn't feel threatened. "I found you by the church. You were unconscious." Emily looked around, absorbing her surroundings. The place felt strange but cozy. She curled deeper under the blanket, avoiding Henry's gaze. "Thank you," she murmured. Henry nodded, watching her closely. "I'll make some tea. You need to warm up." As he moved to the kitchen, Emily glanced once more at the decorated walls. The faces in the photographs seemed happy. Whole families, hugging, smiling at the camera. Families. Henry returned a few minutes later with a steaming mug. "Here, mint tea. It's good for warming the body and soul." Emily accepted the mug with trembling hands. She murmured another thank you but avoided looking directly at him. Henry didn't ask any more questions. He knew some questions needed to wait. That night, Emily woke up startled. The house was engulfed in silence, but she heard a muffled sound coming from the hallway. Sobs. Curious and anxious, she got up from the sofa, pulling the blanket with her. Her bare feet stepped softly on the wooden floor, which creaked under the weight of silence. As she approached Henry's room, the door was slightly ajar. A faint light from a lamp seeped through the crack. Emily leaned against the wall, hesitating, and peeked inside. Henry sat on the edge of the bed, his back hunched, holding an old telephone. He was crying softly, his face hidden in his free hand. "I'm so sorry," Henry whispered. "I couldn't save them. I failed." Emily clutched the blanket to her chest. Something tightened deep in her heart, a mix of compassion and fear. Who had he failed to save? Not wanting to make a sound, she slowly backed away. Back on the sofa, she lay on her side, facing the window where the rain had begun to let up. But Henry's words echoed in her mind, bringing questions she wouldn't have the courage to ask. "I failed." Emily closed her eyes, but sleep didn't return. She knew without a doubt that something in that house was as broken as she was. The sound of rain had stopped during the night, but the sky still hung heavy, as if time itself didn't know what to do with itself. When Emily woke up, the first rays of morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the living room, turning the space into a golden, opaque scene. She moved slowly, her body still aching, muscles stiff from the fatigue of the previous night. The heavy blanket that wrapped around her smelled of wood and mint tea, a comforting scent that contrasted sharply with the loneliness she carried inside. As she opened her eyes, it took Emily a few seconds to remember where she was. She straightened up on the couch, scanning the room with attention. Everything there seemed to have a story. The furniture was old, the cushions worn at the edges, the faded Persian rug, but each piece seemed to tell a silent secret. On the walls hung a collection of black and white photographs, many featuring smiling faces and couples embracing. In one, a family posed in front of an old car. A young woman held a child in her arms while a tall man beamed beside them. Emily got up carefully, feeling the cold wooden floor beneath her feet. Her gaze landed on a shelf in the corner of the room, where worn books were piled, mingled with small relics. A rusty compass, a stopped pocket watch, a topless music box. Everything seemed to have been left behind by someone who preferred to forget. "Good morning," Henry's deep voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts. Emily turned quickly to find him standing in the doorway that led to the kitchen. He held a steaming mug of tea, his expression calm yet tired, as if he hadn't slept well in years. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to mess with anything," Emily murmured, pulling the blanket closer to her chest. "You're not messing with anything, you're just looking," Henry replied with a faint smile. He approached and handed her the mug. "Here, mint tea. You need to warm up." Emily accepted the mug carefully, murmuring a barely audible, "Thank you." Henry studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher her, before sitting in a nearby armchair. The soft morning light illuminated his grey hair and the deep lines around his eyes, giving him an even more fragile and kind appearance. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Yes, thank you for everything," Emily replied, sipping the tea. The warmth spread through her body, bringing a comforting sensation. I'll leave as soon as I can. I don't want to be a burden." Henry shook his head slowly. "You're not a burden, young lady. You just need a little rest, and maybe some time to decide what you'll do next." "Why are you doing this?" The question slipped from Emily's lips before she could stop herself. Henry fell silent for a moment, his eyes wandering to one of the photographs on the wall. His smile faded slowly, but he answered with the same calmness as before. "Because you needed help, and because I couldn't just leave you there in the rain, alone." Emily looked at him, trying to find something more in his words, but Henry maintained a steady, serene gaze, as if there was nothing beyond what he had said. "Eat something. Afterwards, if you want, you can use the bathtub upstairs. I have some old clothes that might fit you," he said, rising with effort from the armchair. Emily nodded, feeling a knot in her throat. She didn't understand why Henry was being so kind, but she couldn't shake the unease that came with it. That afternoon, Emily decided she couldn't just sit still. Not for long. She needed to take action, find a way to support herself. So even though she was reluctant, she put on the simple clothes Henry had given her, a loose dress and a long wool coat, and headed toward the town center. Willow Creek was a small, quiet town, but that day the streets seemed emptier than ever. The few residents Emily encountered cast long, judgmental looks in her direction. She kept her head down, trying to ignore the whispers that hung in the air. In the local grocery store, a burly man in a white apron looked her up and down when she asked about a job. "I need someone to work the register. Do you know how to handle money?" he asked in a gruff voice. "Yes, I learn quickly," Emily replied, forcing a hopeful smile. "How long have you been in town?" he continued, suspicious. "I arrived yesterday. I'm staying with a friend," she said hesitantly. The man raised an eyebrow, disdain evident on his face. "A friend, huh? We don't have any openings right now." Emily felt her face burn with embarrassment. She murmured a thank you and quickly left, her eyes brimming with tears. "Did you see who she is?" The hissing voice came from the corner, and Emily turned just enough to see two older women whispering to each other. One of them was Clara Jones, Henry's neighbor. "A pregnant girl. And in that house, what kind of story does she have, huh?" "God knows," the other woman replied, shaking her head. "That house has seen a lot." Emily clenched her fists and quickened her pace, ignoring the weight of their gazes. She felt a silent anger rising within her. Why were people so quick to judge? She didn't want charity. She just wanted a chance to rebuild her life. When she returned to Henry's house, it was already late, and the sun was beginning to set. Upon opening the door, she found him sitting in the same armchair reading an old book. He lifted his eyes to her, frowning. "How did it go?" Emily took off her coat and hung it up. "They don't want to hire a stranger." Henry sighed and closed the book. "Give them time. Here, everything takes a while to change." Emily walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. The silence that settled between them was thick, almost uncomfortable. "Clara came by today," Henry said suddenly. Emily turned, surprised. "Clara?" "Yes, she wanted to know about you," Henry continued, his voice calm but with an underlying firmness. I asked her if it was a crime to help a young woman in need. Emily looked down, embarrassed. I'm sorry, I've only brought you trouble. Henry stood up with difficulty and walked over to her in the kitchen, stopping beside her. Listen, young lady, don't let what others say get you down. People will always talk, always. Why? Emily asked, her eyes welling with tears. Why are you being so good to me? I don't understand. Henry fell silent, his eyes locked onto hers. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, as if struggling with something inside. Then he looked away and murmured, because sometimes fate gives us a chance to fix things. Before Emily could respond, he slowly withdrew, returning to his armchair. That night Emily couldn't sleep. She kept hearing Henry's words echoing in her mind. Fix things. What did he mean by that? Curious and restless, she quietly descended the stairs and walked down the hallway. Henry's bedroom door was closed, but a faint light spilled through the crack. Emily hesitated, but then she heard the low sound of a conversation. Leaning against the door, she listened to Henry's trembling voice, soft, almost a whisper. I failed, I know I failed. I couldn't save them. I couldn't. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Who hadn't he been able to save? Why was he crying every night? Before she could hear more, Emily stepped back, her heart racing. She returned to the couch, pulling the blanket around her. For the first time, she felt that she wasn't alone in her pain. In that house of silence, both she and Henry carried ghosts, and something told her that sooner or later they would need to confront them. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you think so far. Your support helps us grow and keeps these stories coming. Thank you. And now let's move on with the story. The sky was grey that morning, as if the sun had given up trying to pierce the heavy clouds. A cold wind rattled against the windows of Henry's house, making them creak softly. Emily sat on the sofa, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands, watching Henry as he put on his coat and prepared to leave. I'm heading to the market to pick up a few things, he said calmly, adjusting his hat atop his greying hair. If you need anything, just call me. There's a phone in the hallway. Emily nodded, her fingers idly twisting the handle of the mug in silence. She wanted to ask where he was going exactly, but thought better of it. Since their brief conversation the night before, the distance between them seemed to grow. Henry, despite his kindness and care, carried a heavy silence that made her uneasy. He paused for a moment before opening the door, casting a meaningful glance in her direction. Rest, Emily. That's all you need right now. She forced a smile and watched him leave. The door closed with a dull thud, leaving her alone in the silent house once again. Emily scanned the room, the cup now forgotten in her hands. The scent of peppermint tea still lingered in the air, but it was no longer comforting. It was just a reminder that she was in a place that wasn't hers. She took a deep breath and glanced down the hallway, where a slightly ajar door caught her attention. The room was almost obscured in the dim light of the hallway, but the glimpse of something inside piqued her curiosity. Henry seemed like an organized man. All the doors in the house were always closed, except for that one, which seemed like a lapse in his routine. She rose slowly, her footsteps creaking on the floor. For a moment, Emily glanced back at the front door, as if expecting Henry to return at any moment. Nothing. With her heart racing a bit faster, she carefully pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room smelled of old wood and dust, as if it hadn't been opened in years. The light from the hallway partially illuminated the space, revealing shelves crammed with old objects. There were boxes piled in one corner and furniture covered with yellowed sheets. A shiver ran down Emily's spine as she ventured further in, but curiosity urged her to continue. She pulled one of the sheets away, revealing an antique dresser, with stuck drawers and a surface marked by time. On top of it, a picture frame caught her attention. Emily picked it up delicately and blew the dust off the glass. Her heart stopped for a moment. It was a photo of a young woman smiling, with a rounded belly beneath a simple dress. She was pregnant. Beside her stood a man Emily recognized immediately as Henry, but younger, more full of life. "Who are you?" Emily whispered to the image, her eyes scrutinizing every detail. The woman had familiar features which only deepened her intrigue. She bore a resemblance to Emily, not identical but similar enough to unsettle her. She glanced around the room and spotted another open box, where more old photographs were scattered. Emily crouched down and began examining them one by one. In one, the same pregnant young woman appeared at a picnic, laughing while Henry looked at her with a gaze full of pride. In another, the couple posed in front of an old car, embraced. Henry's smile was so genuine, so happy, that it seemed to belong to someone else. Emily frowned, her heart now racing. That woman couldn't just be a friend or acquaintance. She meant something profound to Henry. And the most disturbing part was the resemblance. "What happened to you?" Emily murmured again, putting the photos back in place. She stood up and looked at the door, still ajar. She needed to get out of there before Henry returned. But just as she was about to take another step, the front door swung open with a bang. "Emily?" Henry's voice echoed through the house, loud and firm. She froze, her blood running cold. His footsteps sounded in the hallway, firm and deliberate. Within seconds, Henry appeared in the doorway of the room. For a moment, silence filled the air. Henry stopped, his eyes wide as he looked at Emily and then at the room. His face, usually serene, darkened with an expression of contained fury. "What are you doing here?" Henry's voice was low but filled with an intensity that made her recoil. The door was open. I didn't mean to." "Leave," he ordered, his tone now harsher. Emily took a step back, the picture frame still in her hands. She tried to return the object to the dresser, but her trembling fingers nearly dropped it. Henry stepped forward and snatched the frame from her, holding it against his chest, as if protecting something precious. "You had no right to go through here." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean what?" Henry interrupted, his eyes shining in a way Emily had never seen before. "Invade my life, unearth a past that isn't yours." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Henry took a deep breath as if trying to control his own anger. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, the harsh expression had softened. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice quieter now. He placed the picture frame back on the dresser and ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "There are things you wouldn't understand, Emily. Things that should remain in the past." Emily remained silent, watching him carefully. The man before her seemed smaller, more fragile, as if carrying that secret was slowly consuming him. "Who was she?" Emily asked softly. Henry looked at her for a long time but didn't answer. Instead, he turned and left the room, leaving Emily alone with the weight of the photos and the silence. That night was difficult. Henry barely spoke to her during dinner. He ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate, while Emily struggled to find the courage to address what had happened. But the words never came. After washing the dishes, Henry went upstairs without saying goodnight. Emily remained in the living room, wrapped in the blanket he had given her on her first night. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each tick echoing like a reminder that something in that house was broken. When the silence finally became unbearable, Emily decided to go upstairs. She walked down the dark hallway, glancing briefly at the closed door to Henry's room. Everything was quiet, but as she moved away, she heard it again. Henry's voice. She stopped, her heart aching, and leaned against the wall to listen more closely. "I failed." His voice came muffled, as if he were speaking on the phone again. "I can't fail again, I can't." Emily felt her stomach drop. There it was again. The same words, the same tone of desperation she had heard before. She pressed her hand against her mouth, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shatter her chest. She returned to the sofa and lay down, her eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling. Those words echoed in her mind like a curse. "I can't fail again." Henry was kind, but he was broken, just like her. As the silence in the house deepened even further, Emily realized something that made her shudder. His story was not just about the past, it was about her. and somehow Henry believed that she was tied to the chance of redemption he sought. The morning began like any other in Willow Creek, calm, silent, with a light breeze carrying the scent of wet earth from the recent drizzle. Henry's house was steeped in tranquility, with only the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen and the rustling of the pages of an old book that Henry was reading in his armchair. Emily, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, seemed lost in thought. Ever since she had seen the photos in the locked room, something within her wouldn't let her rest. The mystery surrounding Henry grew like a shadow, and she didn't know if it was more curiosity or fear. "Aren't you going to eat anything?" Henry asked, folding his reading glasses and looking at her. Emily forced a smile. "I'm not hungry right now." Henry watched her for a moment but didn't press the issue. He knew how to recognize when someone wanted to say something but didn't know how to begin. Slowly he rose, his bones creaking under the weight of the years. "I'm going out to pick up some things from the market. I need flour and coffee." "I can go instead," Emily suggested. "No, don't worry, I like going there. The bustle distracts me," replied Henry, putting on his coat. "Stay here and rest, I won't be long." As soon as Henry closed the door, the house fell silent again. Emily remained alone in the kitchen, stirring her tea with a spoon, listening only to the muffled sound of the clock on the wall. But that tranquility didn't last long. Minutes later, someone knocked hard on the door. She stood up, hesitant, her steps careful. Who could it be? When she opened the door, her heart nearly stopped. Sebastian was standing on the threshold, wearing the same immaculate suit, his face carved with a cold, calculating expression. His blue eyes, which had once seemed charming, now looked like stones of ice. "Sebastian," Emily whispered, feeling her whole body stiffen. "So this is where you're hiding?" His voice dripped with disdain. He looked over her shoulder, surveying the house with a sneer. "Not exactly the place I imagined you'd end up." "What do you want here?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady but failing. Sebastian crossed his arms, leaning slightly. "I want to talk to the owner of the house. Old Henry, isn't it? I heard he took you in. I imagine a man like him has his reasons. Who knows what he expects to gain in return?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Emily shot back, her eyes filled with fury. Sebastian was about to reply when a firm voice came from behind him. "She already asked you to leave." Sebastian turned, surprised, and found Henry standing at the gate holding a bag of groceries. The elderly man's face was serious, his eyes fixed on Sebastian with a sharp glint Emily had never seen before. "Oh, you finally arrived," Sebastian said with a sarcastic tone. "I'd like to know what made you think bringing a pregnant girl into your home was a good idea. I hope you know who you're dealing with." Henry approached slowly, placing the bag on the ground beside the door. He positioned himself between Emily and Sebastian, his expression firm and impenetrable. "The only thing that matters is that she needed help, and I did what any decent man would do." Sebastian let out a low laugh, a sound cruel and cynical. "Decency, don't make me laugh. Do you know what they're going to say in town? That you—" "I don't give a damn about what the town says," Henry interrupted him, his voice surprisingly strong. "You don't know anything about me, kid, and even less about Emily." Sebastian was momentarily speechless, clearly not expecting that reaction. He pointed a finger at Emily, who watched everything with wide eyes. "This isn't over, Emily. If you think you can run away, you're mistaken." Before Henry could respond, Sebastian turned and walked to the black car parked on the street. He got in, slamming the door hard, and drove away, leaving a trail of dust behind. Henry remained standing at the entrance, his gaze fixed on the empty street, as if he were ready to face another battle. Emily was still at the door, her eyes shimmering with contained tears. "Henry," she murmured almost in a whisper. He turned to her, his expression softer now. "It's okay, Emily, he won't hurt you, not while I'm here." Emily nodded, but something in her chest felt like it was burning. The image of Sebastian confronting her, speaking about Henry as if he had dark intentions, wouldn't leave her mind. The silence between them during dinner was suffocating. Henry was quieter than usual, as if Sebastian's words still haunted him. Emily tried to find the courage to ask, but every time she opened her mouth, he looked away, as if he already knew what was coming. Finally, Emily could take it no longer. She let her fork fall onto her plate, the metallic sound cutting through the silence. "Who was she, Henry?" He paused with the spoon halfway to his mouth, his shoulders tense. "Who?" "The woman in the photos," Emily said, staring at him. "She was pregnant. Who was she?" Henry set the spoon down and took a deep breath, as if he were bracing himself for something he didn't want to face. "That's none of your business, Emily." "Of course it is," she shot back, her voice trembling. "I'm here, living in this house, and I know there's something you don't want to tell me. Something that has to do with me." Henry stood up from the table, pushing his chair back with a harsh noise. "I've told you to leave the past where it is." "Why?" Emily stood up too, confronting him. "Why does it hurt you so much? Who was she, Henry? Why do you talk to yourself every night? Why do you cry?" Henry turned, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "Because there's nothing you need to know. Nothing." He paused, realizing the tone of his own voice. When he looked at Emily again, she was motionless, her eyes brimming with tears. "I just wanted to understand," she whispered, feeling a tightness in her chest. Henry ran a hand through his white hair, exhausted. "Emily, I can't, not now." He left the kitchen, leaving her alone once more. The next morning, Emily stepped outside to get some fresh air. She walked to the town centre, trying to push aside the harsh words from the night before. The town felt even smaller that morning, as if the narrow streets couldn't contain her thoughts. As she passed Clara Jones's house, the woman was in the garden tending to some wilted flowers. Upon seeing Emily, Clara looked up, her eyes sparkling with a curiosity mixed with something deeper. "You look tired, dear," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. Emily hesitated, but something about the woman, no matter how curious she seemed, felt familiar. A long-forgotten maternal figure. She stopped near the gate. "Clara, do you know Henry well?" Clara nodded, her eyes focused on the young woman. "I've known Henry Collins forever. He was a different man, you know, before the tragedy." Emily furrowed her brow. "What tragedy?" Clara sighed, seeming to ponder whether she should share. But Emily's silence was an invitation she couldn't ignore. "Henry lost his daughter and son-in-law in an accident. She was pregnant," Clara said, her voice softer now. "She was his pride, that girl. But Henry? He never forgave himself. He was driving the car the day of the accident." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Emily's feet. "He was driving?" she whispered, incredulous. Clara nodded. Henry was never the same after that day. He shut himself away in that house and never spoke about it again. Emily felt tears burning her eyes. Now everything made sense. The photos, the nights he cried, the silent weight he carried. Henry had taken her in not just out of kindness, but because in some way she reminded him of the daughter he had lost. She thanked Clara with a thin voice and returned home, her heart heavy. When she entered, she found Henry sitting in the living room staring into space. He looked up at her, as if he knew what she had discovered. "Henry," Emily murmured, her voice cracking, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Henry didn't respond. He simply lowered his head, his eyes misty, and whispered, "Because I failed once, and I can't fail again." The weight of his words filled the air between them, and Emily finally understood. She wasn't just a guest. She was the chance for redemption that Henry never knew he needed. The afternoon slowly faded in Willow Creek, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. A cold wind blew through the trees, causing the leaves to whisper secrets that no one else could hear. Inside Henry's house, Emily tried to distract herself with a cup of tea and a worn-out book she had found on the shelf. But the reading wasn't progressing. Her mind kept returning to the conversation with Clara from the previous day. Henry lost his daughter and son-in-law in an accident. She was pregnant. The words still echoed in her head. The guilt in Henry's eyes made sense now. He had helped her not just out of kindness, but because he saw in her a living reminder of his lost daughter. Emily wanted to ask more, to understand, but something held her back. Henry guarded his ghost so fiercely that it seemed painful to pry them loose. The sudden sound of a car stopping in front of the house startled Emily. She dropped the book onto the sofa and approached the window, carefully pulling back the old curtain. A shiny black vehicle glimmered under the dim evening light, and a familiar figure stepped out slowly. Sebastian. Her heart raced. He looked out of place in that simple setting, dressed in a pristine suit and polished shoes that sank slightly into the wet earth of the garden. Sebastian had always been meticulous and careful with his appearance, but at that moment there was something different in his expression. Determination and perhaps anger. Emily took a step back, feeling the air leave her lungs. She thought about running inside, hiding, but the firm sound of knocks on the door interrupted her hesitation. Bam, bam, bam. Emily, I know you're in there. His voice made her freeze. For a moment she almost obeyed him as she had in the old days, but something within her had changed since she stepped into that house. She took a deep breath, swallowing her fear, and went to the door. When she opened it, she found Sebastian standing there, a calculated expression on his face. He looked her up and down as if judging every detail of her appearance, the simple dress, loose hair, and tired eyes. You look too comfortable, he commented, his voice cold and low. Why are you here, Sebastian? Emily asked, firm, although her voice trembled slightly. Sebastian raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Oh, Emily, I thought we'd have a mature conversation. Believe me, it's not good for anyone for you to stay here. He glanced into the house over her shoulder, especially with him. Emily felt her blood boil. Henry is a good man. He helped me when you turned your back on me. Sebastian let out a low laugh, a sound full of disdain. Help? Is that what you call it? Wake up, Emily. Nothing comes for free. Do you think he's some kind of saint? Maybe he has his own reasons for helping a pregnant girl who appeared out of nowhere. You have no right to speak about him like that. Emily shot back, her eyes filled with fury. Henry is more of a man than you'll ever be. Sebastian's jaw clenched, but he quickly regained his composure. He shoved his hands into his pockets and stepped closer. Listen, Emily, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to resolve the situation, he said, adopting a softer, almost conciliatory tone. We both know this is all a mistake. I was too hard on you, but I can still help you. Help me? Emily crossed her arms. How exactly? Sebastian pulled an envelope from the inner pocket of his coat and extended it toward her. Here's enough for you to start a new life somewhere else. Away from here, away from him, and away from me. Emily stared at the envelope as if it were a snake ready to strike. Are you trying to buy me? I'm trying to solve the problem, he replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. You know that staying here won't get you anywhere. This town will swallow you alive. And what will happen when the baby is born? Are you going to wait for that old man to take care of both of you? How long do you think that will last? His words hit hard, and for a moment Emily felt a crack in her determination. But then she remembered all the cold nights, all the tears shed alone, and Henry's face, tired yet kind. She looked at Sebastian, her eyes shining with a new strength he had never seen before. Do you think you can scare me? Silence me? I don't want your money, Sebastian. I don't want anything from you. Sebastian's mask of control began to crumble. He closed the envelope tightly and shoved it back into his pocket, moving closer to her. You're making a big mistake, Emily. A mistake that will come at a cost. Don't think you can challenge me and get away with it. Just go away now, Emily said, her voice steady and low. Sebastian leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto hers in a silent confrontation. You will regret this. Before he could say more, the sound of footsteps behind her interrupted them. Emily turned and found Henry standing in the hallway, his face pale but resolute. I suggest you leave now, young man, Henry said, his voice low and controlled, yet filled with an authority that surprised even Emily. Sebastian looked at Henry and smiled wryly, as if he found the whole thing ridiculous. "If that's what you want." He took a step back, straightening his jacket. "But don't think this is over." He shot one last cold glance at Emily before turning to leave. The black car roared to life, leaving only the sound of the engine echoing through the empty street. After Sebastian left, silence returned to the house. Emily closed the door and leaned against it, as if the weight of that confrontation had drained all her strength. Henry was still standing in the hallway, looking down at the floor, his shoulders slightly slumped. "I'm sorry about that," Emily murmured. "He shouldn't have come here." Henry lifted his face and looked at her, his eyes filled with something Emily couldn't decipher. Sadness, regret, perhaps a mix of both. "You don't need to apologize, Emily. It's not your fault." She walked over to the sofa and sat down, feeling her legs tremble. He wants me to disappear, to take his money and leave." Henry didn't respond immediately. He walked slowly to his armchair and sat down with a weary sigh. "And what are you going to do?" Emily looked at him, surprised. "I'm not going to accept it. I can't. Sebastian thinks he can buy everything, but I won't let him treat me like I'm disposable." Henry nodded slightly, as if he expected that answer. But then he fell silent for so long that Emily thought he wouldn't speak again. Finally, he broke the silence. She also believed in someone who didn't deserve it. Emily froze. "What?" Henry didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the emptiness in front of him. "My daughter, Grace. She also believed the words of a man who promised her the world. She was too young, too naive, and he abandoned her when she needed him the most, just like they did with you." His voice faltered, and he cleared his throat, as if trying to maintain composure was the only control he had left. "I should have protected her. I should have—" The sentence died in the air, swallowed by the silence. Emily felt a tear slide down her cheek. She moved closer, kneeling by his armchair. "Henry—" He finally looked at her, and Emily saw that his eyes were red, tears held back with effort. "I failed her, Emily. I let her believe in his lies, and when I needed to be there for her, I wasn't." "It wasn't your fault," Emily whispered, holding his hand. Henry shook his head, his eyes glistening. "It was. And that's why I'm here now. I can't fail again." Emily squeezed his hand, feeling an invisible weight shared between them. For a moment they sat in silence, united by their pains, by their losses. Finally, Henry took a deep breath and murmured, "You're not alone, Emily, not while I'm here." She nodded, tears now flowing freely. For the first time in a long time, she believed, Henry was there, and together, maybe they could finally find the peace they had both been seeking. The fog hung thick that morning, embracing the trees and the old houses of Willow Creek in a silent, cold shroud. Emily followed Henry along a winding path through the woods behind the town. The old man walked slowly, leaning on his cane, but there was determination in his steps. His serious expression left no room for questions. Emily, on the other hand, felt her stomach twist. Since the moment Henry had told her he wanted to show her something, a sense of discomfort had settled in her chest. The dry leaves crackled under their feet, the sound echoing like small snaps that seemed to scream in the silence. After a few minutes of walking in silence, the terrain began to clear. The cemetery came into view, discreet and ancient, with worn gravestones scattered in irregular rows. Some were covered in moss, while others seemed freshly tended, with bright flowers placed upon them. Henry stopped in front of a double tombstone and sighed. "We've arrived." Emily stayed behind him, watching as Henry removed his hat and looked at the two grey stones marking the site. There were names on each, Grace Collins and Matthew Collins. The dates were old, but not so distant that time had erased the pain. "This is where my daughter and my son-in-law rest," Henry finally said, his voice low but firm, "and the baby she was carrying." Emily felt her heart tighten. She slowly approached, kneeling beside him. The silence that enveloped them was heavy, as if the very place carried the weight of what had happened. Henry continued, his gaze fixed on the gravestone. Grace was 22 when she died, young, full of dreams, and she loved too much a man who never deserved her. Matthew wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't ready to be a father, to take on a family. They fought that night. She called me crying, asking me to come get her, and I went. He paused, swallowing hard, his hands trembling slightly over the cane. It was raining heavily. The roads were dark, slippery. I should have stopped, I should have gone slower. But all I wanted was to take my daughter out of that suffering, to bring her home, where she would be safe. Emily placed a delicate hand on his arm, sensing the pain that overflowed in each of his words. When the car skidded, everything happened too fast. I remember Grace screaming my name. I remember the lights coming toward us. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. They told me my daughter and my son-in-law hadn't survived. And the baby... His voice faltered. He closed his eyes as if trying to contain the tears that refused to be shed. I should have died in their place, he whispered. Since that day I carry this with me, the guilt, the emptiness. Nothing has ever been the same. Emily tightened her grip on his arm, tears silently streaming down her face. She wanted to say something, but there were no words. How could she console someone carrying such a heavy burden? When you showed up that night, Emily, wet, alone, carrying a baby, it was like seeing Grace again. But this time I could do it differently. This time I could protect someone. Emily felt a sob escape her throat. She looked at Henry, with his tired eyes and hunched shoulders, and realized he was not just a kind old man. He was a broken man struggling to find redemption. You didn't fail, Henry, she said, her voice choked. You can't carry all that guilt alone. Sometimes things happen. Not because someone deserves it, but because that's how life is. Henry looked at her, his eyes misty but in silence. For a moment only the cold wind blew between them, carrying their pains away. The return home was silent. Henry seemed exhausted, as if every word spoken in the cemetery had pulled a part of him away. Emily walked beside him, lost in thought. She felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the pain Henry carried, and gratitude for him sharing it with her. However, that brief peace was shattered as they approached the house. Emily saw something strange, a small crowd of people in front of the house. Neighbors, curious, whispering among themselves. Clara was among them, her face drawn with worry. As soon as she saw Emily and Henry, the voices fell silent, and all eyes turned to them. "What's going on here?" Henry asked, irritated, forcing himself to straighten his shoulders. Clara stepped forward, clutching her apron with trembling hands. "Henry, the whole town is talking. It's Sebastian. He's spreading things about her." Emily felt her face burn, her heart racing. What did he say? Clara hesitated, glancing at the others around before speaking. "He said you're an opportunist, that you're taking advantage of a lonely old man. He said that that you're trying to trick someone with this story." Emily's eyes widened, anger rising like fire in her chest. She looked around, finding suspicious and judgmental gazes. "That's not true," Emily shouted, her voice trembling. "Henry helped me when I had no one else. He doesn't—" "Enough!" Henry's voice echoed, firm and loud. He looked at the people, his eyes shining with controlled fury. "Each of you has known me for years. You know what kind of man I am. If you believe these lies, then maybe you never really knew me at all." The crowd fell silent, some looking away. Clara stepped closer, touching Emily's shoulder. "I know it's not true, dear. Don't worry about them. Sebastian is the problem, not you." Emily nodded, feeling tears burn her eyes. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her inside the house. When the door closed, silence returned to envelop them, but this time it was a heavy silence. Emily collapsed on the sofa, tears finally falling. "I can't take this anymore, Henry. He won't stop. He's going to ruin my life." Henry sat in the armchair, looking even more tired. "Emily, what matters is what you know to be true. Sebastian can spread all the lies he wants, but I am here, and you are not alone." Emily looked at him, drying her tears. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Henry smiled, a sad, tender smile. Because everyone deserves a second chance, and because I failed once, but I won't fail again." She nodded, feeling a renewed strength grow within her. "I won't give up, Henry. I won't let him win." That night, the storm that had been brewing all day finally broke. The rain pounded fiercely against the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks of the old house. Emily couldn't sleep. She thought about Sebastian, the lies he was spreading, and the pain he was causing not only her but Henry as well. Suddenly, a muffled sound startled her. She quickly got up, hearing something coming from the hallway. Her heart raced as she saw lights on in Henry's room. "Henry?" she called, worried. There was no answer. Emily entered the room and found him collapsed next to the bed, motionless, his skin pale and clammy. "Henry!" she screamed, kneeling beside him and touching his face. He was burning up, his breath weak and irregular. Panic set in, but she knew she couldn't waste time. She ran to the phone in the hallway and dialed the hospital. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. "Please come quickly, he's very sick." Seconds felt like hours as Emily waited for the ambulance. She returned to Henry's side, holding his cold hand and murmuring, "Hang in there. Please, Henry, you have to hold on." The red lights of the ambulance illuminated the window minutes later. The paramedics rushed in, examining Henry and preparing him to be taken away. Emily followed the vehicle in a taxi, her heart tight and her eyes misty. Upon arriving at the hospital, she sat in the waiting room alone, the echoes of the sirens still ringing in her ears. The silence around her was deafening, and for the first time, Emily felt fear of losing Henry. She wrapped her arms around herself, murmuring to herself, "Please, God, don't take him from me too." The door to the treatment room remained closed, and Emily sat there waiting. The storm raged outside, but inside her, an even greater battle was taking place. Henry couldn't leave. Not now. Not like this. So you're enjoying this story? Remember to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It's a small action that makes a big difference for the growth of the channel. Thank you for being here. Let's get back to the story. The hospital was cold and impersonal. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh, uncomfortable glare in the empty hallways. Emily hurried along beside the paramedic, her heart racing as Henry's stretcher was pushed ahead of her. The sound of the wheels on the ceramic floor echoed, mixing with the muffled voices of doctors and nurses. Emily tried to keep pace, but her legs felt weak, as if they were carrying the weight of all the fear building inside her. "Please, he's going to be okay, right?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion, almost whispering to the paramedic who ignored her, too busy shouting commands to the nursing staff. Emily stopped in the middle of the hallway when she saw Henry being taken through double doors into the treatment room. Those doors closed with a sharp sound, leaving her alone there. She stepped back, leaning against the wall, her trembling hands clutching her belly that felt heavier than ever. "Hang in there, Henry." Emily sat down in one of the blue plastic chairs in the waiting area. The place felt like a temporary prison where time crawled cruelly. In front of her, a television was broadcasting a silent news report. Patients came and went, some coughing, others looking as fragile as Henry had moments before. She stared at them but didn't see them. Her mind was locked in that room with Henry. A nurse approached a little while later. She was a robust woman with tired but kind eyes. "Are you a relative of his?" Emily nodded. "I take care of him." The nurse looked sympathetic. "The doctor will be here soon to speak with you, but he's very weak. We've done everything we can to stabilize him." Emily nodded but lacked the strength to respond. The nurse walked away, leaving her alone again, wrapped in torturous silence. Hours dragged on. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her with every tick. Emily buried her face in her hands, trying to hold back the tears, but it was impossible. Henry was the only person who had reached out to her when the world abandoned her. He had given her a roof, comfort, and more than that, a sense of belonging she'd never known she had. "Please don't take him, God, not now." The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway pulled Emily from her thoughts. She lifted her head and saw a man she wished to never see again, Sebastian. He walked toward her as if it were the most natural place to be, elegant in his dark suit, though a bit wrinkled. The shadows on his face showed that he wasn't doing well either, but the coldness was still there. "Emily," he said, stopping in front of her. His voice was low, almost smooth, but still carried that condescension that made her feel small. "Why are you here?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the dry tears on her face. Sebastian shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "I heard the old man was hospitalized. I thought it would be a good time to come see you." Emily jumped to her feet, standing face to face with him. "A good time? My friend might be dying, and you think this is a good time?" Sebastian looked around, uncomfortable with her loud tone, but maintained his composure. "Emily, please, let's not make a scene. Sit down." "No," she replied firmly. "Tell me what you came for and leave." Sebastian sighed, as if tired of the conversation before it even began. "You're living in an illusion. That man can't offer you anything. He can't take care of you or your child. You're alone, Emily." "I'm not alone," she shot back, feeling her blood boil. "Henry is more family to me than you've ever been." "Don't be naive," Sebastian replied, impatient. "He's in a hospital, Emily, and when he's gone, what will you do? You have no money, no home, nothing. You're not just wasting your life, you're wasting your child's life too." Emily flinched. His words hurt because they struck at her most vulnerable point. She knew her situation was unstable. The pregnancy was advancing, and at some point she would have to face the world head-on. But it wouldn't be on Sebastian's terms. He continued, now adopting a softer, almost paternal tone. "Listen, Emily, I didn't come here to fight. I came to offer you a solution. One last deal." "What deal?" Sebastian pulled a check from the inner pocket of his coat and extended it toward her. Emily didn't need to look to know it was a large sum. "You come back with me. We sort things out the right way. I guarantee you'll have a comfortable life. A house, doctors, money. Your child won't need for anything." Emily looked at the check and then back at him. For a moment she felt her hand tremble. The idea of security for her child made her hesitate, but then she looked into Sebastian's eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't there for her. There was no love or compassion in his words. It was just pride, the need to control a situation he had created. "Why are you doing this, Sebastian?" she asked, her voice softer. "Why do you insist on me now?" He looked away for a moment, as if he didn't know how to answer. "Because it's the right thing to do." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "No, it's not. The right thing would have been to be there when I needed you. The right thing would have been to listen when I told you I was pregnant. Now you're just trying to buy me off because you don't want the world to know who you really are." Sebastian frowned, irritated. "Don't be foolish, Emily. This is your last chance." Emily took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. For the first time in a long time she felt strong. She looked directly into his eyes and said, "I'd rather be alone than sell myself for a little peace." Sebastian stood frozen, as if her words had struck him like a blow. He tried to respond but couldn't. That silence was the greatest defeat he had ever experienced. Finally, he put the check back in his pocket, his face filled with disdain. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before turning his back and walking down the hallway. Emily watched him go, feeling the weight of that decision but without regret. When she turned around, she saw Clara standing a few feet away, watching everything unfold. Clara approached slowly, her eyes shining with something Emily couldn't decipher at first. Admiration. "You were brave, dear," Clara said softly. "Few people face a man like him that way." Emily smiled, though the tears were still there. It wasn't easy. "Nothing worth it ever is," Clara replied, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Henry is lucky to have you around, and you're lucky to have him. Hold on to that, Emily." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath. Maybe, for the first time, she truly believed she was capable of facing whatever came next. Night had fallen by the time the doctor finally appeared in the waiting area. Emily jumped to her feet upon seeing him, her heart pounding so hard she felt she might faint right there. "His condition is still critical," the doctor began, his tone professional and controlled. "His heart is weak, and he needs complete rest. We are doing everything we can to stabilize him." Emily nodded, trying to absorb every word. "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated. "For a few minutes. He's sedated, but he should be able to hear your voice." She followed him down the hallway to Henry's room. When she entered, she felt a knot in her throat. Henry lay in the bed, pale and fragile, with tubes connected to his body and monitors emitting soft, rhythmic beeps. Emily approached slowly, sitting in the chair beside him. She took Henry's hand carefully as if he might break. "I'm here, Henry," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone." She stayed there, holding his hand, watching his frail chest rise and fall. Tears fell silently, but she didn't let go of his hand for a second. "Please stay with me, you're all I have." Emily rested her head on the bed, whispering prayers she wasn't sure would be heard. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to dissipate, but inside her, fear still roared like distant thunder. She closed her eyes, squeezing Henry's hand once more, as if she could transmit to him all the strength she had left. And then, for the first time that night, Emily made a silent promise. She wouldn't let Henry go without a fight, and no matter what happened, she would stay by his side until the end. The rhythmic hum of the machines in the hospital was almost hypnotic, but for Emily, it was a cruel reminder of how fragile life could be. Sitting beside Henry's bed, she held his hand gently, as if that simple contact could keep him here, among the living. His skin felt colder than it had that afternoon when he was rushed to the hospital. His face was pale, more lined than before, and his chest rose and fell slowly beneath the white blanket. Emily couldn't contain the knot tightening in her throat, fearing that at any moment that faint movement might cease. She murmured softly, "I'm here, Henry, you're not alone." For hours he lay still, lost in a deep sleep. Time seemed to dissolve in that room, and Emily could no longer tell whether it was day or night. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, her eyes red from crying. Then, suddenly, Henry moved his fingers. Emily startled and looked at him. His eyes slowly began to open. "Henry?" Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with hope and fear. Henry blinked several times, as if trying to recognize where he was. His tired, weak eyes finally met hers, and for a fleeting moment he smiled, a small smile, but full of tenderness. "Emily!" His voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. "Shh! Don't strain yourself," she said, leaning closer, holding his hand firmly. "You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay. I'm here." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. When he opened them again, his expression was serious, almost determined, as if he were gathering strength for something important. "Emily," he tried again, squeezing her hand gently. "At my house, in the drawer of the dresser, there's a key." "A key?" Emily furrowed her brow, worried. "A key? What are you talking about, Henry?" He made an effort, his face contorting with weakness, but he didn't give up. With a slowness that seemed to demand everything from him, he brought his other hand to the pocket of his hospital pajamas. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he pulled out an aged metal key and a folded envelope. Emily looked at them, alarmed. "Henry, what is this?" He placed the key in the palm of her hand and closed her fingers around it gently. His voice came out in a broken whisper. "It's yours now. Do what I couldn't do." Emily looked at the key in her hand, feeling its symbolic weight. "Henry, I don't understand." "You will understand." He smiled weakly, his gaze calmer than ever. "Just promise. Promise that you will take care of it." Emily swallowed hard, tears threatening to fall again. "I promise, Henry, I promise I will take care of it." He nodded slightly and closed his eyes once more, the smile still present on his lips. Emily held the key and the envelope close to her chest, as if guarding something precious. Even without fully understanding what it meant, she knew it was important. The sun was rising when Emily returned to Henry's house. The hospital had discharged her to rest, but she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. The house felt different that morning, too silent, as if the place itself sensed his absence. Emily climbed the stairs slowly, the creak of the steps echoing through the empty space. She entered Henry's room and paused in front of the old dresser. The piece of furniture was covered in dust, but still sturdy, like everything in that house. With trembling hands, she opened the top drawer. Inside, she found a small wooden safe that looked as old as the key Henry had given her. Carefully, Emily fitted the key into the lock and turned it. The click of the mechanism unlocking was loud in the stillness of the room. When she opened the safe, Emily's eyes widened. Inside were a series of organized documents, small photos of Henry with a young woman, Grace. In one of the images, Grace was pregnant, her radiant smile as Henry embraced her from behind. Emily picked up the papers and sat on the edge of the bed, reading slowly. Her eyes grew wide when she understood what they were: Henry's will. He had left everything to her, the house, the savings he had in the bank, everything. She covered her mouth with her hand, her heart racing. Oh, Henry. Emily let the tears fall freely, a mix of emotion and disbelief. His generosity was incomprehensible. He barely knew her, and yet he had trusted her enough to leave her everything he had. But along with gratitude came the weight of responsibility. Emily looked around the room at the walls, the old furniture, the pictures that told the story of a family that no longer existed. Henry trusted her to keep that legacy alive. She pressed the photos to her chest, feeling so small in the face of such a grand gesture. "I promise, Henry," she murmured to the emptiness of the room. "I will take care of this house. I will take care of it." The day passed slowly. Emily tended to the house as best as she could, trying to fill the silence with some form of activity. She cleaned the floors, rearranged the furniture, brewed tea just as Henry liked it, even though he was no longer there to drink it. It was her way of honoring his memory. When night fell, she sat on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands, staring at the unlit fireplace. The place felt emptier than ever. The key was still there on the table, shining under the dim light. It was then that the phone rang. Emily jumped and rushed to answer, her heart pounding. "Hello?" "This is the hospital," a calm voice on the other end said. Emily felt her legs weaken. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Henry Collins passed away a short while ago. He was at peace, free of pain." The phone almost slipped from her hands. Emily stood there, frozen, unable to respond. When she finally hung up, she sank to her knees on the living room floor, the sobs coming with a force she couldn't contain. "No, Henry, no." The tears were hot, salty, and wouldn't stop falling. She pressed the still warm teacup against her chest, as if it could bring her some comfort. Henry was gone. The man who had welcomed her, who had treated her with more kindness than anyone else, was no longer there. The image of Henry in his favorite armchair, smiling as he told stories about Grace, came to mind. The house seemed to remember his presence, and that only made the pain more unbearable. Emily finally lifted her face, wiping her tears. She looked at the key and the envelope on the table and felt something grow within her: determination. She picked up the key and held it tightly, as if she could feel Henry there with her. "I will take care of this house," she murmured, her voice trembling but filled with strength. "I will take care of it." Emily slowly stood up, looking around and taking a deep breath. The weight of responsibility was still there, but now there was something more, a promise, a reason to move forward. The fire in the fireplace, which had been out for so long, was lit that night. Emily sat in front of it, watching the flames dance, as if waiting for Henry to walk through the door at any moment. But he didn't come in, and she knew he would never come in again. Even so, Emily smiled, wiping her tears once more. Henry had left this world in peace, and somehow he had given her something she had never expected to have, a chance to start over. Outside, the wind blew gently, like a whisper of farewell. Emily closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the fireplace enveloping the room. "I promise, Henry, I won't fail you." The sound of hammering echoed down the hallway. illuminated by the morning sun. Emily took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand as she watched the room come to life again. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by golden rays streaming through the freshly cleaned windows. Henry's old house, which had once seemed suffocated by silence and the weight of memories, now pulsed with a different energy. "It's starting to feel like a home, don't you think?" Emily murmured, as if speaking to the very spirit of the house. The main room was almost unrecognizable. The walls, once dingy and faded, now exhibited a soft shade of blue, chosen carefully to give the space a sense of peace. The new curtains swayed gently in the breeze, replacing the old dusty ones that had hung there for decades. Henry's favorite armchair remained in the same spot, but now it was clean, adorned with a new cushion she had sewn herself. Emily smiled, feeling the baby move gently inside her. Her belly was huge, a herald that her daughter would soon enter the world. "You're going to love it here, little one," she whispered, caressing the bump she carried with love and hope. As she organized some books on the shelf, she heard a knock at the door. "It's open," she shouted, not taking her eyes off an old volume of poetry that belonged to Henry. Clara entered, carrying a plate covered with a flowery cloth. "It's not right to work so hard in your condition, dear," she said, placing the plate on the table. "I'm fine," Emily replied, smiling at the woman. Clara, who had once looked at her with suspicion, now made almost daily visits. She was practical and straightforward, but beneath all that firmness lay a generous heart that Emily had come to admire. "Everything's almost ready, isn't it?" Clara asked, looking around with approval. "You've done a good job." Emily nodded, surveying the details around her. "I wanted to keep as much as possible of what he left behind. It feels like he's still here, you know?" Clara took a deep breath, nodding. Henry would be proud. He loved this house, even if he didn't have the courage to take care of it alone. "You've brought life back to this place." Emily felt a knot in her throat. Henry was still present in every corner, in every object. His memory was what drove her to keep going. "I promised I would take care of it, and I will keep that promise," she said firmly. Clara looked at her with admiration. "Well, you're not alone, Emily. This house also belongs to the community, and we will help in whatever way we can." Emily smiled. She wasn't sure if it was due to the pregnancy hormones or the sincerity of those words, but warm tears began to form in her eyes. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." The neighbor nodded, grabbing her bag. "Rest a bit, dear. I don't want that baby to arrive before her time." "I promise I will," Emily replied, laughing. As soon as Clara left, Emily looked around once more. The house was almost ready, but something much larger was happening there. She wasn't just renovating a place, she was rebuilding her life. Henry had given her a chance when no one else would, and now she was repaying that by transforming that space into a home. The night was calm when the first pains came. Emily woke suddenly, her heart racing. She took a deep breath, feeling the twinge in her lower abdomen and knowing exactly what it meant. The moment had arrived. She carefully got up, using the wall for support. Calm down," she murmured to herself, trying to control her nerves. Minutes later, Clara arrived in a hurry, accompanied by other neighbors who had been alerted by a desperate phone call. The house, which had been a place of silence and work for the past few months, was now filled with voices, hurried footsteps, and frenetic energy. "Breathe deeply, Emily," Clara said, holding a towel and organizing the space next to the bed. "The midwives are on their way. Everything will be all right." Emily nodded, her eyes closed as another contraction came with force. Sweat trickled down her face, and she squeezed Clara's hand as if her life depended on it. "It hurts so much," she murmured, her voice trembling. "It will pass soon, dear," Clara assured her, glancing around. "Courage, you are strong." The hours dragged slowly, but every minute felt like an eternity. The neighbors took turns helping Emily and keeping the atmosphere calm. One of the midwives, an elderly woman with white hair and experienced hands, guided Emily with a soft and encouraging voice. "You're almost there, Emily, just a little more." Emily screamed as the final contraction hit, her entire body consumed by nearly unbearable pain. And then, like magic, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Relief washed over her, followed by tears of emotion. "It's a girl," the midwife announced, smiling as she placed the baby in Emily's arms. Emily looked at her daughter for the first time, the delicate face, the still-closed eyes, and the small body wrapped in a white blanket. Tears flowed freely down her face as she held her gently, as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. "Hi, little one," Emily whispered, her voice choked. "You've arrived." Clara watched the scene with misty eyes, holding the hand of one of the younger neighbors. The atmosphere in the room was filled with pure emotion. Emily seemed so fragile, yet at the same time stronger than ever. The next morning the house was quiet again, but this time not out of sadness. The sun streamed softly through the bedroom window, illuminating Emily's face as she slept beside her daughter, who lay peacefully next to her. Emily slowly woke up, feeling the pleasant weight of exhaustion after childbirth. She looked at the little girl beside her and smiled, stroking the fine dark hair that clung to the baby's forehead. "You're perfect," she murmured. Next to the bed was an old photo of Henry and Grace, the daughter he had lost. Emily gazed at the picture for a long time before picking up the baby in her arms again. Gently she whispered, "Your name will be Grace, in honor of her and in honor of him. His legacy continues, Henry. Thank you for believing in me." In that moment, something shifted inside her. There was no more emptiness, no more fear. Emily felt a deep peace, as if somehow Henry were there, smiling and approving of her choice. Later, Clara returned with a group of neighbors, all carrying small gifts for Grace. Handmade clothes, wooden toys, little packages of food. For the first time, Emily felt she belonged there. The community that had once ignored her now embraced her as one of their own. "She's beautiful, Emily," Clara said, holding Grace in her arms with a genuine smile. "And you look beautiful too, a true mother." Emily smiled, feeling tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of happiness. "Thank you, Clara, for being here." "We're all here, dear," Clara replied, looking at the other neighbors who nodded with warm expressions. "You're not alone anymore." The afternoon passed in a flurry of laughter, conversations and small celebrations. Emily watched it all from Henry's old armchair, with Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. She looked around and realized how much that house, once so lonely and sad, had transformed. Now it was a place of life, love, and hope. Henry had left, but his legacy continued through her and Grace. Emily knew she would still face challenges, but she was no longer afraid. With that house, that daughter, and that new family around her, she had everything she needed. As she looked out the window, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Emily took a deep breath, holding Grace closer to her chest and whispering, "We're going to be all right, my little one. We're going to be all right." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The morning sun bathed the old house in soft light, filling every corner with a warm embrace. The transformation was evident. The place that had once been dark and silent now pulsed with life and hope. In the open windows, white curtains danced gently in the breeze, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sounds of laughter and animated conversations echoing through the halls. Emily walked barefoot across the polished wooden floor, a shy smile on her face as she carried Grace in her arms. The little one, with her dark hair and curious eyes, took in everything around her with the pure wonder only babies possess. "Good morning, my little one," Emily murmured, kissing her daughter's forehead as she entered the living room. The room was filled with life. 4 women, all at different stages of motherhood, animatedly chatted around a large wooden table that Emily had restored with her own hands. Babies napped in weary arms or played on small rugs spread out on the floor. The atmosphere was light and warm, as if they were all finally home. "Emily, you've exceeded my expectations with these muffins," teased Vanessa, a young woman with blonde hair tied up in a bun, balancing her baby in her lap while devouring a piece of the homemade treat. If I had known I was coming to a feast, I would have brought a recipe book, added Linda, an older mother laughing as she ran her fingers through her son's unruly hair. Emily smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction. These women were more than just guests. They were friends, companions on a journey who shared the same pains, fears, and hopes. Henry's house, which had once been a symbol of grief and solitude, was now a refuge where single mothers found support and a fresh start. I couldn't have done it without you all, Emily said, pulling out a chair to sit down. Each of you has brought something special to this place. Henry always said that a house only becomes a home when it is filled with love. Silence fell for a moment as they all reflected on those words. He must have been an incredible man, said Clara, who had become almost a motherly figure to Emily in recent months. She held a cup of tea, glancing at a photo of Henry that Emily had placed on the mantel. He was, Emily murmured, looking at the picture with affection. Henry believed in me when no one else did. He saw something in me that I couldn't even see myself. And you did the same for us, Vanessa replied, smiling. This house, this group, it's the chance we never thought we'd have. Emily felt her heart swell. Every face in that room, every voice, was a testament to the resilience that Henry had so admired. She looked at Grace, who began to fuss in her arms, and smiled. Let's go, little one. It's time for a nap. As she climbed the stairs with Grace, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she was no longer alone. She had built something beautiful, something enduring. By late afternoon, Emily decided to organize some boxes that had been sitting in the attic since the renovations. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet as she slowly ascended, balancing Grace in one arm and a lantern in the other. The attic was cleaner now, but it still carried that scent of aged wood mixed with dust. Emily found a corner where some boxes remained untouched. Setting Grace on a small blanket on the floor, she began to open the old containers. Books, old photographs, small objects that Henry had kept over the years. Emily picked up a yellowed envelope that was under a pile of papers and carefully opened it. Her breath caught as she recognized Henry's careful handwriting. A letter, she whispered, sitting on the floor to read. Emily, if you are reading this, it means that the house has finally found a new life just like you. When we met, I no longer believed in second chances. I carried the weight of a past that could not be fixed, and this house was merely a reminder of what I had lost. But then you came along. You brought light where there was only darkness. You brought hope where I only saw despair. And most importantly, you brought life where there was only silence. Thank you for giving me a second chance, even if you didn't know it. You were the miracle I never expected. Make this house a home, Emily. Fill every corner with love, laughter, and dreams. Grace is proof that the future can be more beautiful than we imagine. With love, Henry. Tears began to roll down Emily's face. She held the letter with trembling hands, each word from Henry echoing in her heart. You brought life where there was only silence, she murmured, repeating the words like a mantra. Grace whimpered softly, and Emily picked her up, holding her close to her chest. She looked around the attic, feeling the weight of the past, but also the lightness of the present. Henry was gone, but he was in every detail of that house, in every shared laugh, in every gathering of the mothers who now called that place a refuge. Thank you, Henry, she whispered, clutching the letter tightly, for believing in me. I promise I will never forget what you did. As dusk fell, Emily sat on the porch of the house with Grace asleep in her arms. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the setting sun cast a golden light over the freshly tended lawn. The voices of the mothers and their children still gently echoed through the house, creating the perfect soundtrack for that moment of peace. Emily looked out at the horizon, where day slowly gave way to night. The breeze blew softly, and she closed her eyes for a moment, as if she could hear Henry's voice once more. Make this house a home. She opened her eyes and smiled, looking at Grace. You are growing up in a place filled with love, my little one. A place where people start over, where stories are healed, This house, it is ours now. Emily thought of everything she had experienced since arriving there. The abandonment, the fear, the loneliness. And then Henry, that old man with a wounded heart who had welcomed her without expecting anything in return. He had given her a second chance, and now Emily was doing the same for so many other women. She looked around, feeling the warmth of the moment. Henry's old house, which had once been an empty structure, was now a home. Each wall told a story. Each room held laughter and tears. Holding Grace closer, Emily whispered, "Your name means Grace for a reason. You are hope. You are the new beginning, and this place will always be a refuge for those in need." The wind blew stronger, swaying the trees around and making the porch curtains dance. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but it wasn't from the cold. It was as if Henry were there, watching over everything with that discreet, satisfied smile she knew so well. "I did it, Henry," Emily murmured, looking up at the sky. "I made your house a home." Grace stirred in her arms, letting out a soft sigh as if she were at peace. Emily smiled, wiping away a solitary tear that rolled down her cheek. As the sun disappeared on the horizon, the house was enveloped in a serene silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of meaning. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a peace she hadn't known in a long time. The house that love built was complete. Emily's journey reminds us of the incredible power of second chances, resilience and love. Henry's house, once a place of silence and loss, transformed into a sanctuary of hope, a true testament to how kindness and compassion can heal even the deepest wounds. Sometimes, the most unexpected people enter our lives and change everything. Emily not only rebuilt her own life but also became a light for others, showing that from pain can come strength, and from loss can bloom love. What about you? Have you ever found hope in the most unexpected of places? And what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next one. Leave a comment and tell us what resonated with you the most. Also, check out the next recommended video by clicking the card on your screen. You won't want to miss it. Thank you so much for being here, and see you in the next story.